So welcome back. Now we talk about the chapter 4 of Design Your Thinking. So essentially the fourth chapter is the first stage of design thinking, which is inspire. And often people ask me that why shouldn't problem solving be starting with the problem? And what is inspire all about? But think about that. Has it ever occurred to you that you have solved a problem and even with your best effort, the customer isn't happy? And it happens because perhaps you have solved the wrong problem. Maybe you have solved the symptom in the pretext of the problem, which means that problem is not so important. What is important is what is behind the problem. As Jocko Willink wrote in his book Extreme Ownership, he says that always look what is behind the target, why the customer is asking such and such thing, and that is the inspiration part of it. Now we can think of two reasons for innovation to happen. The first reason could possibly be inspiration, that you inspire to do something, and the second could be desperation. And we know of organizations where innovation happen out of desperation because a competition is inched ahead, or that somebody out there is really wanting them to change the way they have been doing business, or the market is demanding change. And at the same time, there are those organizations which are doing phenomenally well, and yet they tend to innovate and they outperform themselves. So in either case, whether it is aspiration or desperation, I guess inspiration is the starting point of innovation to happen. Now, I start with a lot of quotes and a lot of questions, examples in this particular book on inspiration. So the first step of inspiration is to set a design thinking vision. Why do you need design thinking? Now, when I talk to my customers, they come up with typically two requests. One is teach me design thinking, and second is help me solve a problem. And I've seen that those customers who start by asking help me solve a problem, and in that process I teach them design thinking, they have a better tendency of to be able to apply some of these insights to their life rather than teaching design thinking in isolation. So I think what's very critical is why design thinking. And we have Intuit, the financial software organization based out of the US, which has been a very big proponent of design thinking from a very early stage. And that's the reason why Intuit, being a small organization, has managed to remain independent for a fairly long time. And this vision has to be a stretch vision. If you remember, in the previous chapter I discussed about what are the pretexts or preconditions of applying design thinking, and one of them is audacity of goal. So you don't really want to use design thinking as a sledgehammer to drive down a very tiny nail. So I think the more audacious your goal is, the better leverage you will be getting by using design thinking. So that's where the stretch is a very critical aspect. And a good case study that we have in creating a stretch vision is the mission Mars, which is the mission that ISRO's created to put our satellite out there. Now, we didn't have heavy lifting rockets the way NASA had, but we had this PSLV, which is our backhorse when it comes to putting satellites in the outer space, but we didn't have that kind of a reach. So we improvised, and the improvisation is quite world famous, and the book talks about that quite a bit. Similarly for PepsiCo, when Indra Nooyi became the CEO of PepsiCo, one of our vision statement was to make Pepsi a much more nutritious and health conscious organization. Being a mother, and that too coming in from India, which is typically scarce of resources and water, etc. So over her tenure of more than a decade at the organization, what Indra managed to do is to transform the company from a more indulgence driven organization to a very health conscious organization. Again, an example of stretch. So the stretch and the audacious goal really comes in the form of a design brief. And what I've seen is that the organizations which have a very clear design brief as to why we are applying design thinking and for who, they end up getting much more results than the rest of the firms. And a good example that I cite in this book is the very famous Zuzu's ad by Vodafone. So in the midst of the 2009 IPL season, where the whole session was shifted to South Africa because of general elections which were happening in India, they had to create an ad every day, a new ad every day. Now, how do you create a new ad every day? Ad shooting, production, post-production, all of that takes quite a bit of time and budget. Now, how do you get new ads every day? Because you can't dish out the same ad to the customer, which becomes stale after a point of time. So Zuzu was a great innovation on how Vodafone really went about creating that kind of an excitement. And many people still remember the very cute Zuzus that they saw for the very first time during the IPL season. Now, when you're creating a stretch, a very powerful mechanism of doing so is using the power of metaphors. Now, what are metaphors? Metaphors are placeholders that can conjure up image of what you really want to convey in the least possible words. Japanese have been very famous for using metaphors. For example, Honda City was often deemed as a tall boy, maximum man maximum, machine minimum, and a great example of that is Mahindra and Mahindra. Now, Mahindra and Mahindra revolutionized the auto industry in India with the launch of XUV 500, which was a runaway success. It was an amazing example of ground up design and development from India. And what metaphor did they use? They used the metaphor of cheetah. Now, if you look at this vehicle very closely, many of these design elements of the SUV have actually been inspired by the beast in the wilderness. They actually went to Kenya to see how cheetah behaves, what's the habitat of cheetah like, how does the animal take a stance, how does the animal attack, the stroll in the evening, etc. And they try to bring all of these elements from the wilderness onto the car. And no doubt it is an amazing case study that we have on how do we do design in India and not just make in India. And for that to happen, you have to really widen the aperture. What I've seen very consistently with leaders who embrace innovation like Mr. Anand Mahindra is the fact that they always try to draw inspiration from unrelated space. If you're an automobile company, you just don't draw inspiration from another automobile company, because at best you can just be like them and you can't beat them. And that is where, how do you draw analogies from nature, which is called as biomimicry, or from other organizations which are nothing to do with your firm, is very critical. And that can happen only when you invite diversity into your organization. Not diversity of the usual kind like gender, but diversity beyond the fault line. The diversity which is not so palpable and not so visible in terms of educational diversity, in terms of introversion, extroversion, in terms of even sexual orientation, etc. And I think when you embrace that diversity, not only it speaks volume about your tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty, but also some of the ideas that you can get are quite phenomenal. And Satya Nadella, when he became the CEO of Microsoft in 2014, had one of these big initiatives to bring a very rich diversity into his organization. And he's been a big champion of minorities, LGBTQ, and women in computing. And the results are for all of us to see how the organization is performing brilliantly in his stewardship. Similarly, back home, we have Lemon Tree Hotels. Lemon Tree is an exceptional organization in India where it has taken a pledge of having a certain percentage of its employees with persons with disabilities, right from the chef to the bellboy to the people in the housekeeping. We have a whole host of people with disabilities being employed, and often it is seen that they are better in terms of attention to detail, customer centricity, understanding the nuances of the customers than the abled counterparts of theirs. So I guess we have a lot of fantastic examples where we have diversity. If I talk about my own career, when I was at Wipro in 2007-8 time frame, I used to be a part of the CTO office. And one of the biggest draw for me during my tenure at Wipro was the sheer diversity that we could pack under one roof. And the amount of learning which I had in the process was quite phenomenal. I also talk about Bosch, which is a very big proponent of diversity in India, and the kind of people that they have drawn from the ranks. And that's the reason why this organization has been ruling the roost for a very long time. So I close the chapter on Inspire with a very quick example of what kind of a diversity you can have in the organization. And a very good reference is Tom Kelly's fantastic book called 10 Faces of Innovation, where it talks about the learning personas, the organizing personas, and the building personas. And what I would encourage you to do is to go ahead and read the chapter and figure out what kind of persona are you. For example, I consider myself very much as a cross-pollinator and a storyteller. Okay, I would be quite glad to know what do you identify yourself as. I hope this first chapter on design thinking stages, which is Inspire, was of use to you. In summary, before you start solving a problem, understand why the problem has to be solved. How the problem has to be solved is not so important, because that can be thought of at a later point of time. But if the why part is not answered clearly, then I think it's a very big issue with us. To close the chapter, let me tell you a small story. So a friend of mine who stays in Bangalore drives a Santro to his office. Now, as you're aware, the pet peeve of people in the city or even outside the city is traffic. and nobody is immune to the traffic woes. So again, our man is also struggling with traffic. Now what happens one day is that he gets promoted. Now any bloke who gets promoted in his office would most probably trade for a better, bigger car. He doesn't do that. On the contrary, with the available money that he has, he gets himself a driver, a chauffeur. And as it turns out, the chauffeur for a Santro, which is a small hatchback, turns out to be cheaper than that of a sedan. So he gets himself a chauffeur. And for the remaining money, what he does? He buys a Kindle. Now here we go. A man has a same Santro with a chauffeur in the front and a Kindle at the back. He sits in the rear seat and he finishes a book every single week. And he can't be more thankful to the same traffic which he was swearing by till recently. Now, did he solve the problem of traffic? The answer is no. He didn't solve the traffic problem because he did not have to solve the traffic problem. Now, imagine if I started my design thinking expedition with traffic as a problem. I wouldn't have gone anywhere. But if I just take a pause and ask the question that why do I need to solve traffic as a problem? What's the inspiration behind traffic? And suddenly I discovered that traffic is a problem because it leads to wastage of time. So now we understand that the problem is not traffic. The problem that I need to solve is wastage of your time. And between solving the traffic of Bangalore versus wastage of your time, which problem do you think is more solvable? Of course, your own personal wastage of time. And that is precisely where we start the problem for. So the design thinking as a model is very front loaded in the sense that before you roll your sleeves and get into the act of problem solving, you need to really think hard and redefine the problem. Redefine the problem in a manner that if solved has a higher leverage than redefining it in a way that can't be solved. So in summary, design thinking doesn't require hard work, it requires hard thinking. And thinking hard is rarer than working hard. So I hope this was useful to you. Now we go to the next chapter, which is empathize and define. Thank you so much.